has hit back at the United States in the brewing trade war. A list of 30 items that India imports from the US will now attract higher import duties. India's move comes on a day when China has threatened to slap the United States with more tariffs. The European Union has gone ahead and announced a 25% duty on a range of US imports. So can India get Trump to back down in these trade wars? To talk more on this, I'm joined now by Dhruva Jaishankar. He's fellow in foreign policy studies at Brookings, India, and Jayant Dasgupta, former ambassador of India to the World Trade Organization. Very warm welcome to both of you, and thank you for speaking with us here at Bloomberg Quint. Let me start with Mr. Dasgupta, and it's interesting because India already has a complaint pending in the WTO, but we've gone ahead and announced this list with the date of August 4th for when the tariffs come into place. Are we buying time? Is this sort of a warning shot, Mr. Dasgupta?
You know, the US had imposed tariffs on us in March on steel and aluminium products, and they are going to hit about $241 million worth of US imports from India. Now, India waited and, of course, made informal efforts to get the US to withdraw the tariffs against Indian exports, but that did not work out. So India on the 18th of May sent a message to the WTO, notified to the WTO that it intended to raise tariffs on 20 products worth about $166 million. But still the US did not pay heed. So India was, in a sense, its hand was forced, and it is just retaliating to the extent of approximately $240 million worth of US exports to India. And because there is no reciprocity in the sense that the US does not export that much of steel and aluminium products to India, so India couldn't have hiked the tariffs exactly on the same product lines.
Yeah. No, so we've chosen a range of products across agriculture and other sectors, chana, etc. But the question to you, Mr. Jaishankar, is that are we hoping for things to change before August 4th? Because we've given this some time. At the end of the week, you have US representatives coming to India to speak on this matter. So are we hoping that we have more room for negotiation before these tariffs actually kick in?
Well, you know, I think there are different ways of looking at it, and I think there are some differences even within the Indian establishment as to how to respond to this. But I think the larger context is important to keep in mind. President Trump ran his election campaign on, amongst other things, a strong skepticism of global trade. He argued that the United States had been sort of a net loser from having relatively open markets. But most of that ire was really targeted, was directed at one country specifically, China, with which the United States has a very large trade deficit. Now, after a year of this playing out, over the past year, in 2018, we have seen the U.S. taking a much more strident position on trade issues. And how it has gone about doing that, even though some of the sympathy in many other countries for the issues the U.S. is dealing with in its bilateral trade issues with China, how it has gone about doing that has really hit a number of other markets as well. So not just China, but obviously the European Union, Canada, and India included. Now, India does enjoy a trade surplus with the United States, and the U.S. knows when it's doing this that it has a lot of cards because it is a relatively open market. But the way it's gone about doing this has hit multiple targets at the same time, and India is in some ways collateral damage and is feeling that. So I think we need to keep this backdrop in mind that this isn't directed at India specifically, although India is feeling the brunt of this along with other countries. Now, the Indian response now will have to be seen whether this makes any difference at all to Trump's overall trade position, or whether certain carve-outs can be made for India. But in that sense, the ball, as Ambassador Dasgupta correctly pointed out, the ball really is in the US's court on this issue now.
That's an interesting way to put it. And in plain speak, it's not that Trump has a problem with just India. He has a problem with everyone, and we're part of that package. Taking that logic forward, Mr. Jaishankar, in that case, the Trump administration cannot really grant any concessions to India. Because in the Trump world, the policy is that the US has been dealt with unfairly, and all of this must change. He's gone on to say that the United States has been like a piggy bank and people have just been taking. With that hard a position, there's very little room for negotiation, isn't there?
No, I mean, I think this will now fall into the domain of the trade negotiators. I think the political effect has already been felt, seeing that resonate in some ways with his own base. But I think, again, the real target is really sort of manufactured goods, with the concerns about what they saw as steel dumping. And again, particularly, this was really targeted not at India, but at other markets. Now, the question is, can India use what leverage it does have to see a more favorable outcome? And so I think it is possible to find some ways out of this, and this is why the forthcoming talks are taking place. But I do think that this is a larger issue, and India is in many ways collateral damage to a larger political position taken by the Trump administration.
Okay, so in that case, then Mr. Dasgupta, with tariffs on products worth about $250 million, how much of damage can India really do? Is this big enough of a warning for the United States? What's the outcome if these tariffs do go on and it develops into a more bitter situation? Who gets hurt more? What does India stand to lose?
You know, you have to look at India's exports to the US in the past few years. Last year, I think it was approximately $48 billion. And India imports approximately $26 billion worth of products from the US. So obviously, if it gets into a full-blown war between India and the US, which I hope will not take place, then India stands to lose much more than the US does. That is one thing. The second aspect of this is that India imports from the US, apart from the items that have been put on that list. India imports a lot of diamonds, for instance, at zero tariffs. India imports mineral oil. India imports machinery and high-tech products, and a lot of capital goods, all of which come in at 5% or less duties. So the average tariffs for the US imports into India are quite low. Harley-Davidson, of course, is an exception, and it is part of India's policy to have high tariffs on autos, which it is entitled to have under the WTO commitments. And that has encouraged, in a way, the setting up of the auto industry, and it has also started exporting in substantial numbers from India. So it is part of our industrial policy. So I don't think we can be faulted for having provided jobs to our people through the export industry, for having tried to set up a strong base in hitherto new areas like autos. Yeah. And that is what needs to be reconciled between the US and India.
No, I mean, from pretty much day one, it was clear that Made in India and Made in America was going to clash somewhere with a Trump administration. We're possibly seeing the fallout of all of that. But Dhruva, your view on how this is going to play out? Can India really afford to pull the trigger and enter into a full-blown trade war? Will we do that, or will we wait and see what China is doing? Because China seems to be a bigger player with the stakes much higher.
Sure. I mean, I think the danger I would point out is not in India taking a tough negotiating position, which India is perfectly entitled to do under the circumstances, but rather India effectively taking a bullet for China. I think if India doesn't play its cards carefully at the WTO, there's a risk of that happening, which is India bearing the brunt rather than China, which is Trump's primary intended target. So I think that will be something I think to be wary of. But that being said, again, I don't talking about roughly 1% of bilateral trade that's being affected so far. And so I think in some ways it can be contained. We will be seeing next month a strategic dialogue taking place at the ministerial level between the US and India, involving the foreign and defense ministers of the two countries meeting together for the first time. And so, I think a bigger concern is that some of these differences over trade and to a lesser degree immigration issues as well will bleed into the larger strategic conversation between the US and India, where in fact there's been greater convergence over the last year between the US and India.
That point you were making, Dhruva, can you explain that in a little more detail when you say that there is danger of India taking the bullet for China? What do you mean? Can you lay that argument out?
Yeah, no, I think that if India takes, in some ways, Ambassador Dasgupta could speak much more to this, having actually represented India in similar negotiations. But if there are concerns, I think that India sort of taking a position that is in some ways more forward than China in a forum such as the WTO on these matters, and bearing what that might lead to is in some ways Trump turning his attention on India rather than China, which is really where he and his political base's primary concern is when it comes to trade issues. So I think India will have to play its cards quite carefully in the multilateral setting, and on the bilateral setting, I think there's a concern about sort of letting the differences on trade infiltrate into other areas of bilateral cooperation between the US and India. But I think if India can manage these issues, I don't see. This is some hard bargaining, and I think India is perfectly entitled to do that.
No, absolutely, we are entitled and we must. But Mr. Dasgupta, I just want you to elaborate on the point that Dhruva made. Right now, it's a very careful balancing trick, isn't it, for India? We don't want to be target number one in this situation, and the focus shifting to India rather than China. That's the point Mr. Jaishankar was making.
I would like to place a few facts in this context. On the 8th of March, the US imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on a number of countries, including China. And I think it amounted to approximately $300 million. And I'm sorry, it was approximately, yes, $300 million. So the Chinese also retaliated, and they chose an equivalent amount of US imports into China. They have already imposed the duties a long time ago. So that was the first outbreak of hostilities between the US and China. Now the US has gone ahead and it has said that it would impose tariffs on $50 billion more of, now of course it has modified it to $34 billion. So that the Chinese have said that they will retaliate. So that is the second, exchange of fire. Now, India is just responding to the first exchange of fire, which took place in March, to which China has already retaliated. The Europeans are going to retaliate from tomorrow. Yes. And India has put off the date after a great deal of hesitation to the 4th of August, pending the talks that Mark Linscott and his team are going to carry out in India next week. So India has been restrained. India has given ample time to the US to introspect, to reflect on India's position. And I don't think we have been quick on the trigger on this matter. But, everything has to have closure. And if unilateral action is being taken by one country, another country is making a diplomatic request, it's giving a kind of a warning by notifying to the WTO, then waiting for at least a month, then again, deferring the imposition of duties by another month and a half. I think that is very diplomatic on the part of India, and India is very careful not to get into the line of fire between the US and China, because their relationship, especially on the industrial front, on the financial front, is on a different footing than India. As also the strategic front, as Dhruva has mentioned.
Sure, but I think important also to put this in the context of the United States we're dealing with today, which is essentially with a Trump administration which has shown itself to be unpredictable. We're looking at a situation today, Dhruva, where the European Union has come in with tariffs. China has already got some and strong warnings. India, of course, in the picture. Are we looking at a much larger fight in which India will bear the outcome like other nations and blocs? Yeah, that question is for Mr. Jaishankar. Yes.
Relatively flat over the last. I think the different ways of looking at it. One is that global trade has been flat for the last few years, and so in some ways, what had been a positive sum discussion a few years ago on trade issues is starting to become a bit more zero sum, and has been for the last few years as well. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. Two, I think at least in terms of trade in goods, India is still, depending if you want to see it as a glass half full or glass half empty. On the one hand, India is less exposed than most major economies, but much more dependent on trade and services. On the other hand, the potential, particularly given Prime Minister Modi's own emphasis on Make in India and boosting exports and so forth, the potential is much greater. India is either more vulnerable or less vulnerable than many other major economies when it comes to the global trade conditions as well. So I think there are different ways of looking at it. Depending on which set of data points you want to pick up. But again, a lot of it will depend on how India plays, and if it plays it smartly, I think there can be ways for India to come out relatively unscathed. On the other hand, as always, if there are ways that this could get worse very quickly.
Mr. Dasgupta, you wanted to come in on the point of India now dealing with an unpredictable sort of administration.
That of course is something which nobody can predict, the behavior of the US administration at this point in time. So a lot of people, very knowledgeable people who had been following the trends in global trade had thought that President Trump's administration would, indulge in a bit of bullying and arm twisting and then get what it wanted and shut the door or close the door on this, like it did in respect of Korea. But what has happened is that the threats didn't work out with Canada and Mexico, for instance. They have refused to negotiate with the US, pending the removal of tariffs on steel and aluminum, which the US has refused to do. So this is something which is the new factor in the equation, that President Trump is escalating and he's not getting the satisfaction from the trade deals or the negotiations that he was expecting to have, barring Korea, which was a very small concession which the Koreans gave. So this is what is happening in essence, that I don't think there is a great deal of clarity in the US actions, because off the cuff, when China said it would retaliate against $50 billion worth of its own exports, the US said we will do it for $100 billion. When the Chinese announced a date for the 6th of July, the US has said we will do it for $200 billion. Now, that is showing that there is not a great deal of thought going into the process, apart from the knee-jerk reaction of raising the ante.
Well, Trump prides himself on making deals and making the most successful ones. How will India work around that kind of a situation? Of course, is something we'll be keeping a sharp eye on. Thank you so much, Mr. Jayant Dasgupta and Dhruva Jaishankar, for joining us today.